Hi, everyone. Before Shabbat arrives this weekend, I wanted to take just a moment to connect with you directly. This has been a very dramatic and difficult week for our nation, for all of us. Like many of you, I'm sure I've spent the week watching the news and reading the paper, feeling by turns terribly sad and at times quite inspired about things that are happening in our nation and in its streets. Like you as well, I've spent this week reading the emails and public statements and social media posts from community institutions who have reached out to assert their position about racism and racial violence in our nation. Some of you have reached out to me over the past few days asking when it is that I or our temple would be issuing a similar statement. So I wanted to take just a few minutes today to explain to you why it is that I won't be writing one. I understand the motivation behind the rush to put out this sort of statement, and I appreciate having heard from those of you that have expressed how important it is to you. Statements of principle like this help affirm that our faith communities, our schools, the businesses we patronize are responding to injustice in ways that are in keeping with our own codes of morality. I do understand that impulse and I resonate with it too. But if our response to suffering and injustice is simply to issue a statement, then I believe we are doing the least strenuous sort of advocacy there is. If you are upset and angry this week about racial injustice, I don't want to issue a statement that will make you feel better. Instead, I want you to hold on to those feelings of sadness and anger and resentment so that we can use them to stand up for those who have been and continue to be victimized by racism. Beautifully written statements don't mobilize us toward action because that's not the reason they're created. Beautiful, inspiring statements of principle are meant to be moving and cathartic. But catharsis is different than progress. Now, that's not to say that this isn't a time for emotional expression. I want you to be saddened and angered, outraged by George Floyd's death, and by Breonna Taylor's death, and by Ahmaud Arbery's death, and so many others. But our anguish is not enough. As I said in the sermon that I delivered a week and a half ago, and I'm providing a link to the text of that sermon below, our obligation isn't just to oppose racism with our hearts and our minds. Our job as Jews is to denounce and dismantle it. The reason that I'm not writing a congregational statement opposing racism is because I want to ask something of you instead. Something different from what we've done in the past. This time, in the wake of terrible tragedy and days of rage and awakening, instead of stirring symbolic words, let's get together and do something real. Let's step into the discomfort, into the pain. Let's educate ourselves. Let's commit ourselves to using our privilege and our resources to help those who live in racism's crosshairs. There are lots of ways to start. Next week, Stephanie Carlson, our Director of Congregational Learning, and I will be convening two separate opportunities for discussion in which we'll listen to the voices of Jews of color and talk about what it means to create a Jewish community centered on and committed to equity and hospitality. Our social justice core team identified the work of racial justice as its top priority over a year ago and is now accelerating that initiative methodically and thoughtfully and productively to find ways to examine and address our own implicit bias, ways to make our congregation more attuned to the imperatives of racial equity, and ways to advocate for justice in the community. If you're interested in being a part of this work, let me know, and I'll put you in touch with a member of the core team directly. If that kind of work doesn't speak to you, let this be the month that you make a commitment to reading a book about the experience of Black Americans in our cities. If you can't take on a whole book, read an article or watch a documentary film, listen to a podcast. Give tzedakah this month to a charity that supports and protects people of color. patronize a minority-owned business here in Houston. I'm happy to make recommendations in any of these areas to you. Just drop me a line. The important thing is just that we start. So that's why I haven't and I won't be producing a heartfelt statement this week opposing racism. Instead, I'm asking you to come along with me to do the work of anti-racism. And if that decision to focus on actions instead of words, if that leaves you uncertain about where I stand on this issue, if you have the impression that I am in any way ambivalent about racism and racial justice, if it's not clear to you by now that Black Lives Matter, to me, to our community, and to the foundational values of Jewish life, then I'll accept that I have a lot more work to do. And it's work that I'm willing to undertake. But I want to invite you to come with me, to stand by my side and do the work together with me. I want to thank you for being a part of this sacred and principled community. I want to wish you a Shabbat of peace, of learning, and most importantly, of justice and conscience and commitment. Shabbat Shalom.